Who was Jesus, and did he really exist? When investigating Christianity, we can talk about lots of things. We can talk about grace, we can talk about sin, we can talk about justice and how the world works and how it came to be. But ultimately, Christianity is founded on who Jesus is and if he really existed. If Jesus didn't really claim to be God, if he didn't really do the miracles he claimed to do, if he didn't die and rise from the grave, then the Christian faith is worthless. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 4, Paul says if Jesus has not raised from the dead, then our faith's in vain. We're going to firstly look at Jesus. Did he exist? Is he a real historical person? And then secondly, we're going to look at the Gospels. Can we trust what's written in them? There's a really famous quote that you might have heard about. We know more about Jesus than we did about Julius Caesar. But behind the big broad statement, there is historical evidence that says Jesus definitely did exist. Let's take Julius Caesar for a minute. We know loads about him. There is lots of external historical documentation about who he was. And all of that is sort of dated between 100 and 300 years after his death. But most of the stuff that we know about Julius Caesar is from himself. The stuff that Caesar said about himself in that moment lines up with the other evidence that kind of came up 300 years after his death. So let's consider Jesus for a minute. We have the biblical texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. The first four document Jesus himself, and Acts kind of documents the early church that started just after Jesus' death and resurrection. But alongside those, there are also texts outside. Some of them were Jews, some of them were Romans, some of them supported Jesus, some of them didn't care about him. This other evidence about who Jesus was comes from people who were just good historians, documenting things that they saw and heard. There were literally eyewitnesses in the church and outside of the church that were documenting these things. The things with Jesus, they happened really close to his death. Like we're talking 10, 20, 30 years. And when those things come together, we get some historical evidence that you just can't deny. That is that Jesus historically existed as a person. Jesus also went round and multitudes of people saw him, what they believed to be performing miracles. We also know that Jesus kind of got into conflict with the state, that he was executed under a guy called Pontius Pilate. And shortly after his death, Jews and those who weren't Jews put their trust in him, followed him, and started the early church. Those are historical facts that come both from the Bible and also from outside sources. So that then boils down to the question, what do you make of the person called Jesus? So in order to make up your minds about Jesus, the best place to go is the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those four all document who Jesus was, what he was doing at the time. I think one problem that we have when we come to historical texts like the Gospels is that we kind of think, oh, why are they all different? Why are there kind of inconsistencies in the stories? Why does one talk about one thing and the other talk about another thing? Why does one explain a miracle in this way and why does one explain a miracle in that way? But historians would push back on that and say, actually, the fact that these texts are different kind of adds to the authenticity of them rather than take away from them. Imagine you were getting reports from the football game, Liverpool versus Crystal Palace the other day, and you've got different people in the ground in different places, all writing kind of with a different purpose. Someone might say, Fabinho lined up his shot and smashed the ball into the top corner from 30 yards out. Someone else might say, the defenders were distracted by the incredible run of Mane so that Fabinho got the space to ping his shot into the top corner. They would be eyewitness accounts of the same moment, but from different angles, from different perspectives. The one moment is explained in different ways, told with different words. And these are all unique to the eyewitness that's watching it. Some of those statements are written for the more die-hard fans. Some of it is written for the person who's maybe watched football once or twice and you lose some of the terminology that person wouldn't understand. In a way, that's what we get here in the Gospels. They are all documenting what they've seen in their own type of way with different people in mind. You know, I've been looking through Matthew quite recently, and he keeps alluding back to kind of miracles that link with maybe Old Testament stuff that the Jews would have definitely understood. Whereas Luke is writing for his friend and kind of wants to fairly document what's happened with Jesus so that his friend can understand more about who he was. If all of these accounts were exactly the same, if all of the football accounts were exactly the same, you'd be a bit suspicious, right? You'd be thinking, hold on a second, there's some copy and paste jobs happening here. As for the accuracy of the Gospels, historians say that about 99.9% of the words that we have here in English translate perfectly to the way that they were written in the first place. You might hear statements like, you know, there are loads of inconsistencies in the Gospels, but those inconsistencies are actually kind of really small details that don't matter to the big picture of the story. You know, a little bit like, oh, was that word a male or a female pronoun? We're not quite sure. As for writing down what happened, what we have in front of us is pretty much exactly what the eyewitness account said that happened way back 2,000 years ago. Now, this video is intended to just be a quick sweep for you, to maybe get you to think, hold on, Jesus really did exist. And actually reading the Gospels is a really plausible and okay way to examine who he was. And if you're satisfied by some of the things that I've said, then that's awesome. I encourage you to look at the Gospels, take a look at maybe Luke. Luke's a good one to go for. See what Luke writes about Jesus, and kind of make up your own mind about whether he is who he says he is, the Son of God. However, I know that if you're watching this video, you might be like a history buff and you might be like, I really want to dig a bit deeper into this. If that's you, then I can kind of point you in the direction of some other things that will help. So the first thing that I suggest is to go to a YouTuber called The 10-Minute Bible Hour. He makes some really great videos, and he's got a 30-minute video on how we can know that Jesus and the early church existed. He basically suggests that right now we like to think in scientific terms, but actually science can't answer all of our questions, and we need to turn to things like history. And so he talks through some of these outside historical documents that help to back up who Jesus was. And the comments are just full of skeptics that are saying, you know what, I didn't think Jesus existed before watching this video. This is really helpful. I'll leave his video in a link below this one so that you can watch that if you want to. And for the second thing, I'd recommend this book, Can I Really Trust the Bible? It's a really short little book that wants to kind of give people confidence as they pick up their Bible to know that what they're reading is legit. And that's a bit more of a scope of the whole Bible in of itself. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope that this video helped you think some of those things through, and I'd love to see you in another one of these kind of videos again in the future. Take care. Thanks for watching.